Hello and welcome everyone to today's first virtual programming. My name is Maren Williams and I am the SAIC Galleries Programming Director. This afternoon's virtual program has closed captioning. To use this feature, you can click the CC on the bottom of your screen. I'll first start off this afternoon's program with a quick introduction to SAIC Galleries before introducing today's programming. SAIC Galleries is a student-run organization dedicated to the exhibition of student-made artwork and functions as a hub for individuals from every part of the institution to converge around ambitious development of artistic, conceptual, and professional practices. The SAIC team is led by 5 student directors who work closely with artists, gallery, and professional staff in the wider SAIC community to select and facilitate a number of exhibitions each school year. We exist to reflect, interrogate, and elaborate the myriad aesthetic, social, and philosophical concerns of the SAIC student body, and to serve as a platform for meaningful exchange. So welcome again to our very first virtual event of the year, Ache of Erosion, a Conversation. Today we'll be talking with Ache of Erosion artist Elisabeth Heying, and SAIC graduate coordinator, associate chair, and assistant professor of painting and drawing, Andrew Falkowski. Elisabeth is in her final year of SAIC's Master in Fine Arts program and is the director of the Studio Lab in SAIC's painting and drawing department. Ache of Erosion is on view in the Site 280 gallery until Saturday, October 16th. SAIC Galleries is open to current SAIC students, faculty, and staff, and open to the public by appointment. You can find more information about visiting the gallery on our website. Before we dive into today's conversation, we'd like to start the program by sharing a 2-minute video of the exhibition space and several of the works. After the video plays, we'll get started with our conversation. Throughout the program, I invite attendees to use the chat box to share your thoughts and reactions. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the program, we'll open up the conversation for questions. So without further ado, let's get started by watching the video. Great. Now that we've seen the video and had a small taste of the exhibition space, which Elisabeth is zooming in from the exhibition space this afternoon, Elisabeth, could you share a little bit more about your exhibition and your practice to get us started with our conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Maren. Ache of Erosion is an exhibition. I sort of came up with the theme after having made a good majority of the work in it and kind of looking around my studio and realizing, oh, there's a lot of sort of overlapping themes here, both in terms of subject matter, a lot of similar approaches in material that kind of engages this idea of erosion in various ways. So the show is comprised of works that both, the subject matter, the actual images of the works have to do with sites of erosion or erosion prevention or mitigation strategies. But then on a more sort of metaphorical level, I think the work operates in another way, which is sort of this idea of the world kind of falling out from beneath your feet. So that's sort of a little framework on the show. I am here right now, but I'm kind of tethered to the computer, which is probably a good thing, so I don't go on a walk with the laptop. So my practice in general is I'm a painter. I love material, I love paint. It's learning about material and paint is something that really drives my practice forward and is extremely generative for me in the studio. I very much think about paint as a sort of mechanism for inquiry and for exploration. I think of the painted surface as artifice, like maybe even from the video, but surely in some of the images that we'll be showing in a bit. There's a lot of tactile, a lot of buildup. A lot of people will say, oh, these look so sculptural, which they definitely are, these works. But I think that this idea of like the painted surface as this layer of artifice that can give the viewers either a surface sort of texture, tactility to experience, or a space to enter into. It's really about this crust that we all kind of exist on, a playing field per se that kind of defines its own parameters, as and then it stops and it's on a canvas or on a panel. So I think that's that kind of ideology about painting is an important framework for the work that I'm doing with it. A lot of my work, it's kind of born out of representation. I think of space, the space around us as the thing that contains ourselves. It's hard to know what we would be without our surroundings, what our surroundings would be without us. I think there's a lot of room for overlap and informing of our identities and our experience just in the way we move through the world and in the way the world kind of pushes back against us. So space, which is grounded in representation to start with, is very kind of central to my subject matter. Yeah, I would say maybe I'll leave it there for the introduction.
All right, so one question that you and I talked a little bit about is this idea of that site, but like a super basic pragmatic question would be, is it a specific place? Like, is it a beach that you go to, or is it more of a metaphoric site?
In terms of the subject matter and the work?
Like literally the image, right? So we're talking about these things as being, they're images, but they're also like these material surfaces. And I think it's after maybe we talk about this, we should actually talk about how the surfaces, there are different kinds of crust, right?
Yeah.
So, but this actual site that you're talking about or making pictures of, is it a specific place that you go to, or is it all invented?
I think it's all comes from direct sort of observation and experience of place. That place is not one place. I have the privilege of just being able to look around and think about it, but a lot of the places here are the places I spend the most time. So Chicago, Minnesota, there's some Ecuador in here for sure. There's some Mexico. I've only been to Mexico once, but it's fairly recently. So anyway, the places I actually, am in and spend time, it does come from direct observation. I have like thousands upon thousands of just like little crappy, like, images on my phone that I kind of just take wherever I go. So it is born out of kind of direct observation, direct experience of place. But when I'm actually working, I don't work from photos. I feel like it kind of chops off the painting at the knees for me. Like I just need to let it be its own thing. So it might be sort of, an agglomerate of several different images that I've sort of collected. Sometimes I'll do like a loose sketch to kind of define my own space within these places I've been or things that I've observed. But it's mostly just kind of like me and the paint and my mind when I'm actually working on it, not really like looking at a reference image or anything.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, because one thing that we were talking about is this idea of, at the outset, you talked about yourself as being a painter, but what the show also does really represent is the idea that like you work discursively. You actually work through materials and image in a really varied way, right? So it might be worth thinking about or talking about, like, I don't think it's particularly neatly defined, but there's lots of different kinds of surfaces in the show, which then sort of imply how you think about space, and also how you're thinking about the emotive capacity of a surface as a metaphor, right? Sort of in a lot of different ways. It's not one, right? You're not using like one kind of surface with one kind of paint to do one kind of thing with one kind of interior space.
Yeah.
There's quite a range.
Yeah. And I think for me, the reason why that feels like the way for me to work and create is it feels like genuine exploration to me. It's all kind of comes out of this deep wonder, this deep curiosity of almost trying to understand things and the way they move and the way they come together, and then the way we see that in relationship to these other things about its sort of actual identity as a thing or a space. And so I do feel these different approaches as kind of, I don't know, maybe in itself like the center part of the inquiry.
Yeah, that's
maybe this is a good time to look at some of those closer images that you organized, Elisabeth, just to kind of set the framework a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. Okay. So thank you, Lindsay, for working our slides behind the scenes. So I just have it's not a comprehensive selection of the works in the show, but I do have some images here so we can talk more specifically about what's happening here, these things that Andrew was mentioning. This work is called Tarp Landscape 1. There are 2 up on view in the show right now. It's made from perlite, which is that like white poofy stuff in soil that looks like little balls of styrofoam. It's that. Perlite is actually, it's a mineral, it's a volcanic glass that it pops and expands, and it's like these little glass bubbles almost to 13 times the size of its original mass. And it's perlite as you can buy it at Home Depot. It's a mineral used to sort of aerate soil. And so this piece, Tarp Landscape, has a structure of perlite adhered together with acrylic as the glue. And then on top of it is this erosion blanket, which again, Home Depot. Erosion blanket is that sort of like black tarp you see that gets buried under the ground a little bit to kind of keep the ground together. I encased it in acrylic, so I made it basically an acrylic paint skin out of it. It feels about like a fruit roll up. And then there's just sand adhered on top of it. So there are 2 of these in the show. These next 2 pieces, this one and the one that will follow, are called Constructed Diversion, Slip Through My Fingers 1 and 2. And so these actually start with the same process as the Tarp Landscape. So those black forms, which from that great side view, you can see how at least get an idea of how sort of lifted off the canvas it is. That's the same perlite mineral understructure glued together with this erosion blanket, like fruit roll-up consistency over top. The difference here is that then from there, instead of just leaving it almost as is, I kind of pushed it back into this pictorial space where you've got acrylic mediums that are parading as barnacles and algae and other sorts of things. The water is a very sort of like high tacky gloss surface. And so this is the second one that has this very same process as well. Yeah, and so image-wise, what we're looking at is these forms, which are usually filled with sand or some other filler material that are then, wrapped in fabric and embedded in the sand of beaches and shorelines to kind of prevent the sand from being swept away from it. So it is this sort of erosion thing, the understructure of which is kind of built with erosion materials. And then, yeah, pushed into more pictorial space from afar, but then up close kind of falls apart into these different weird acrylic surfaces. This next little series, ground swatch numbers 1 through 8, these are small. These are 6 by 6 inches on the panel, and they're just made with acrylic. Yeah, so this, as opposed to incorporating, materials that are specific to any sort of meaningful process, it's just paint. I think the acrylic in these works is, I always struggle to find the right verb for it. I say emulating, I say embodying, or performing as the surface that is being represented. I do think that, I don't know, something about the verb of that is important to me. And then all of these little pieces were sort of built up and built up and built up with different sort of layers of acrylic mediums to get us kind of as close to the surface as possible. And they have these craggly edges that overhang the sides of the panel a little bit, almost as if they were just like plucked out of the ground or something. So this piece, Grout and Fault Lines, this is oil, just oil paint on canvas. It's 52 inches tall by 30 inches wide. So it's kind of a tall, narrow painting. Here, the thing that's kind of interesting here is used as like a filler extender medium. There's a lot of perlite in this painting as well, like in the paint that I made for the painting. But perlite, not from Home Depot, perlite as like a finely ground artist grade pigment. Perlite is also used as like a filler in a lot of construction things because it is so lightweight. But it's very interesting to me that, the same material that has all these different sorts of construction and industrial uses is also like literally just a painting pigment as well. I mean, that's what these things are. They come from the earth. So I will say, yeah, that sort of material rhyming through different applications is really interesting to me. And here we've got the pipes that are built up. You can kind of see in some of these detail images. But again, those are just paint. So it's a combination of like actual relief of the paint and then a sort of like illusionistic rendering around it. There's a lot of glazing and scumbling happening to kind of create the dark area on the top versus the lighter area in the bottom left corner. So that, kind of pulls it from just surface into the illusionistic space. These works are the kind of like the babies of this piece behind me, which is a drawing on paper. These works that are called Taken from the Ground and Bound Back Together to Prevent the Ground from Falling Apart, pieces 2 and 3, are pieces of this larger drawing that's over my shoulder here that have been removed from the drawing. They've been glued to the face of a wooden panel. And then I made like ropes, like little sort of noodles or strings out of acrylic paint, let them dry that way. And then I sort of wove them onto the surface of these drawings on panel. And the whole title, it's sort of, I wouldn't say like poking fun, but I think it is supposed to kind of reflect this kind of funny, very human, earnest attempt of like, oh, why don't we take these rocks, remove them from the ground, wrap them together in this chain link, and then put it back in the earth on this, like, by this mountainside that we chop down, or this riverbank that we want people to be able to, come and hang out at. I don't know. So it's again, this sort of like reordering of the earth in ways that are, I don't know, really earnest and maybe indicative of ourselves. But yeah, I think the process of making those kind of embodies that a little bit. And then these last three paintings that you'll see images of, these are all egg tempera paintings. They're just little landscape paintings, very small. They're 10 by 8 inches, little vertical paintings. They're on a casein gesso ground, muslin laminated around a panel. I think of these as kind of little like moments of, they're called sediment sentiment. There are 6 so far and that are on view in the show, but I will be making more of these. I'm working on the surfaces for them. But I think of these works as, you know, kind of pictorial, illusionistic space painted with egg tempera, which is a very sort of like luminous, very luminous medium. I think of these as little moments of meditation throughout the show, or almost like punctuation or breath marks offered to the viewer, like this sort of, you know, I feel like there's a lot of like the surface pushing you out and kind of making you feel those edges between the space around you and yourself that I was kind of mentioned earlier. And these, I think these operate differently. They kind of invite you in. It's like, sit down, weary thinker, you know, just soak it in kind of thing. So there are 6 of these throughout the space, and these are 3 of them.
So the one that we're looking at right now, it's what number is it?
Sure, maybe 5.
I think, yeah, 5. What I like about this one is that it does get into, at least on the pictorial side, it starts to hold a lot of the kind of considerations that you're making throughout the show, right? So we talk about this idea of entropy versus containment, right? It's 2 different ways of 2 different forms of abstraction, one sort of implying culture, one implying nature, right? It's literally, you know, divided in the picture between the bottom left and the top right. And it's simultaneously, and I think maybe the other ones do this a little bit more, but we talked about this idea of a lot of the images oscillating between indexing and abstraction, right? And I think that's what maybe the other ones, the more physical ones, do. But I think this one sort of connotes that as well, where it's simultaneously, it is close enough to these things that we would see in the world that it feels like it's an index of it. But then when you actually boil it down, they do feel like tactile abstractions, right? You know, there's something about that I think is interesting. It's really held in this image here, right? So that was one question I have is, and that's something, you know, we've talked a little bit about the show, but one thing that we really hadn't talked about is this idea of this constant, perpetual, either perceptual, physical, or like maybe metaphoric tension that's bound up in almost all the work in the show. Is that something, first off, is that true? And the second thing is like, is that something that as you moved along through the show, that's something that you were continuously investigating?
Yeah.
Good,
Yeah.
done.
Check that one off. Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think it was something that you know, I work out of a home studio. And so about the most formal situation I can get these in is sitting in front of the fireplace or something. So bringing these down and seeing them on the wall and then trying to figure out how to kind of put them together where it does let you float in that space of this, like, I kind of think about it as like, you know, you've got the perceptual kind of, you know, what is the image? Where are we? What is this?
Right.
You've got the physical, okay, like how is this being built up? Like what's actually happening here, literally in the material. And then the metaphor of like, okay, now how are you feeling about this? Like, is this what is happening in relationship to your body and relationship to the viewer? I think that kind of like mushy little like sand pit in between is kind of the point, you know. It's sort of like this, how do we try to string this together? How do we understand these things? So yeah, I totally think that little trifecta, and perhaps there's other sort of points on this map as well, but I think that is like a super core little triad of what's happening in these works.
Yeah, because you're also doing it in terms of the material. And again, we're, you know, because you're you and it's got the material lab. We're always talking about materiality, but like you're also doing that in terms of like, you have these pictorial analogies, but then there's that switch where you talked about this at the beginning, where you have the erosion blanket, right? Where that looks like, for all intents and purposes, a kind of a monochrome, right? But then in other images, it switches, and then you use that same material and switch it from being something that's, yeah, like there it reads as like literal, it's essentially like some kind of ready-made, right? It's transformed a little bit, but it's really sort of presented as is. But then other images, you use it and sort of put, like you said, put it into a pictorial space, and then it becomes sort of metaphoric, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's a sort of sliding between things that are not necessarily dialectic, they're not necessarily in tension, but it's something that we, conventionally don't see in certain kinds of landscape paintings. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So that was one of the things that was really nice about seeing the show in person, obviously, is like you see, the more you're in the space, you see how you are oscillating and reorganizing these different ideas and also these different surfaces, so that it really just pushed this idea that it's a propositional series of questions as opposed to like any kind of definitive statement,
Mhm.
and I think that's one of the reasons I really like about it as a painting thing, because painting for like the last whatever 160 years have been propositional, but like how we understand ourselves in relationship to all these sort of environmental issues, right? Whether it's entropy, containment, global warming, all that stuff. It's all sort of built into these tensions of how we organize, how we hold, how we sort of like stack, right? Or how impotent we are in terms of changing what these developments might be, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I think there's, yeah, both. I think there's an element of control to them too, or at least it kind of makes people consider their own control, or what control do they have, or to find, again, I think of, yeah, where does yourself and your feelings start, or
Mhm.
the space around you start, like those sort of like blurry yeah, in between in between planes that kind of squish together in different ways.
yeah, and I think are you trying to keep it in that sort of middle spot, or is it really just like you start making a painting, you have a kind of an inquiry with the material, and then it sort of just extrapolates out, and this is something that just seems to be endemic to this kind of body of work?
I think that um, that mushy spot in between, the mushy spot is where I want to be. I don't think about these as necessarily like material tests or studies. I do those things. I definitely do those things, but here I'm thinking about, how are those material studies, how can they be enacted to kind of find this strange meeting point that makes it like hard to articulate.
Yeah. Well, I guess it also lends itself to multiple viewers coming at it with their own interpretive way of thinking about things, right? So it leaves it a little bit more open, which again goes back to that idea of like, these are more, I guess examination is not the right word, because it feels like it, like you said, they're very ordered, right? Like it's really clear that in each, let's say, type of work, there seems to be, well, I guess that would be the question. Do you have a formal, or do you have like a conceptual task in when you make these things? Does that make sense?
I think it does. It's really hard, honestly, it's really hard for me to like split those apart, for me to think about what is formal and what is conceptual in the way that I work.
Yeah.
So I would say not that they're the same, but that they're kind of laced together for me.
Yeah, sometimes I think one begets the other, right? Like,
Yeah.
and you and I talk a lot about materiality just out of our own sense of curiosity, and it seems like that's a starting point, and then what it extrapolates into becomes sort of maybe not definitive statements or definitive conceptual positions, but it's something that opens up like a kind of like an emotional location, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder if kind of on this train right here, Marion or Andrew, if you would want to, it's hard for me to describe what it's like to look at them because I also kind of know how I made them. So I get kind of like lost in that. I wonder if either of you could speak a little bit to just the experience of looking at the pieces for the viewers who maybe haven't seen the show yet.
yeah, Maren, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The piece that I have found the most striking when I have visited is, it wasn't shown in the slideshow, but it's the big work. It's very large. Yeah, there it is. It's very large when you're in it in person. And it's so striking to me because one of the things I love to do in Chicago is go down to the lakefront and jump in the water. And when that painting, what it captures is what it looks like to look down on the concrete before you jump in. And Elisabeth has done an amazing job because the ground is ridged. And when you look at this painting, it looks how it feels on your feet. But it's also so interesting because we talked about this before, is it's changing, it's reorienting, something that you would normally look down at, you're looking straight up at. Something you'd be on top of is now in this position to almost consume your body.
Yeah, that would be the same, like embodied response that I had. Like when you go through the show, you have those little egg temper paintings that create a sense of interior pictorial space, right? So, and they're also small, and although a lot of them actually don't have a horizon line, so they're still kind of displaced. They have a tendency to displace you as well. But exactly what you said, like there's certain paintings where I know that I'm looking forward, but I'm no, like in my bodily experience, because the work gets close enough to how we experience these things in the world that I would know to like feel like I would be looking down, right? And then so as I go through the space, I keep doing that all the way through. And then they sort of function as these kind of what Elisabeth was talking about, where they're like these crusts that create this kind of facades or tableaus, but then even the ones with the pipes, they have these little ways of sort of like entering into it, right? Even the drawing to to Elizabeth's left, everyone else, there you go, yeah. Even that one is a facade of rocks, but then Elisabeth cuts out those little holes and then creates like a sort of like window within the window thing. So then that becomes that facade that then creates an interior space where we can sort of are invited to go into. So the work is constantly switching and redistributing you, not only through the room, but also like relocating you in relationship to your body, right? And that's not something you would normally maybe see within a show as consistently. Like the work is constantly doing that. So as you walk through it, if you spend time with it, you're constantly like thinking about yourself in relationship to location, which is kind of great because normally white cubes are supposed to be neutral, right? We're supposed to look at those spaces and be like, anyone can go in there and put in their show and it stays elegant enough for it to look like a proper, ritualistic space for viewing. And at the same time, neutral enough so that anybody else can do the same thing, right? And do it in a slightly different way. But that's one of the things I really like about the work in general. The more I think about it, is this idea that Elisabeth is pointing us to how we would see these squishy spaces in the world. And maybe not have like a grand, like definitive statement of like what you should feel, but that it is a space where we are negotiating our relationship to those environments.
Yeah, I think that was really beautifully put. Thank you.
Yeah, it's disorienting in the best of ways when you're physically in that space and looking at those works.
I think one just kind of interesting thing, and this idea of, yeah, sometimes, not recently really, but sometimes I've been asked, oh, like, do you know the answer? Like, are you trying to trick us? And it's like, no, I'm not trying to trick you. I think,
What?
what?
The answer to what?
the answer to like the proposition within the work. Like, is it like, oh, I know this thing and I'm just like trying to, toy with you, or, make you wonder, like, is it paint or is it not paint? And I think, I think the answer for that to me is no. I think it all comes from a place of very genuine inquiry and curiosity and wonder and feelings of smallness in the vastness of everything and time. So I think, I think I'm glad to hear from you guys that this idea of reorienting or sort of questioning, it seems like a proposition and not like I'm trying to mess with you or something, because I'm not,
Yeah. Well, I think it's also, as a subtext to it, is that's also how you deal with the idea of, let's say, skill, right? Or like technique or whatever. Like materiality is often like, it gets codified in certain kind of like cultural camps, right? There's sort of like expression, then there's like the academic, then there's like any number of ways that we can kind of look at it. But what I like about how you were thinking about it is that it gets us close to this idea of a location, but it's not necessarily trying to like show off, like show provability, right? And because there's certain areas, like let's say particularly like the egg tempera paintings, they are subjective, right? They totally look like an interpretive painting. But then some of the other ones, the abstractions, I was thinking like the little square guys.
the little ground swatch paintings.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, they look like trompe l'oeil, like a physical trompe l'oeil thing. That is like the thing, right? And then those are two really different ways of thinking about how we picture the world around us, right? Which means that they're two totally different ways of thinking about the notion of skill in relationship to materials. Is that something that you think about much in when you're making work?
The relationship between skill and material.
Yeah, models of skill, right?
Models of skill.
That gets into like this idea of models of labor, right? Like maybe skill is too loaded of a term, but it could be like models of labor.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I think more about, I will say I don't really think about that. It's not something I think about while I'm working. I do think, I think trompe l'oeil comes more from the idea of visual trickery, of sort of, flaunting this skill, like Roman times, this like skillful painting of sort of like, oh, you thought this was, a piece of paper. Well, it's not, it's a painting. Yeah. I don't think about that. What I do think about is what things can be. So I think the modality of material pushing that and kind of figuring out like, okay, what can this do? Which could be, categorized as a skill, I guess, or a way of producing skill in a way of highlighting the skill of the material or something.
Yeah, it's just something I was thinking about. Because like when you're using different kinds of material, like we both know it does different things, and then those different things have different sort of like spectrums of possibility, which then goes into this idea of like there's different kinds of emotional temperaments, right? And one of the things that's nice is that all of the works still, even though you often throughout the show are going in wildly different directions, they all do relocate towards this space, right? And I totally thought the space was like just some, shabby Chicago like beach that people kind of forgot about, right? I didn't know that it was like this broad spectrum of all these things, right?
Yeah, I do think about that too. And I mean, the types of spaces that like images, the places that I'm kind of working from, there's, I think, a great specificity to them and a great generality to them too, where it's almost, it's sort of like it is this exact spot and this exact stick and this exact scrap of detritus that we can't quite identify what it is or something. But then it's also any lakefront, any place in which, you know, the water meets the land, or the land meets the elements, or, you know, a surface that has been tread upon and day in and day out for, you know, years and years and years. So I think, yeah, that almost hyper specificity and hyper generality kind of allows people the opportunity to say, hey, this is the beach in Chicago that I go to. And for Chicagoans, you know, some of them super are. Some of them definitely are that beach in Chicago, you know, like Montrose Point. But I think, yeah, I think that offering that like hyper specificity and hyper generality, and also just like the micro macro of the way the material functions, I think those kind of run in parallel together within the work, within the body of work, when you look at it as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I like about like yeah, that's what I like about the idea of like how you use that transition from ground to water. That's often, we know this through like the history of painting, is that's often like an idealized space, right? Mm-hmm. And then here it's totally not, right? It's a space where it is, there's a series of like physical forces that are kind of at their core in tension, right? And there's something nice about using this genre that's just loaded with all that romance, and to sort of like reorientate it towards this other dilemma, without like a whole lot of like dystopian, you know, dread or anything like that. It's just more this using your materials and then using this space to sort of hone in on the thing that you are most curious about, which is curiosity. Does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, that's something I really like about the show, just in general. And what I like about it also is like, you don't do it once, you do it in lots of different ways and lots of different iterations. And the work, the more you look at it, the more that those connections are made between multiple types of modalities, I guess, that you have, right?
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool too.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely, I guess if there was one way to ask the questions I'm trying to ask, I suppose I would just do that, you know. But I think kind of innate in the question of, you know, who are we and where are we, and how does that sort of co-evolution of people in space, like what is that, you know? I think there is no one way to answer it, or no one way to think about it. And so for me, this you know, in pursuing an inquiry, this idea of, okay, well, let me approach it from this side, let me approach it from this side, let me approach it from this side, and at least then I will maybe not know, but at least you know, I think it's about the attempt to understand these sort of like bigger, I don't know, existential ideas or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the show's titled Ache, right? Ache of Erosion.
Yeah.
So was that maybe I don't know, end effect of looking at the work collectively and being like, oh, that's what I'm actually thinking about?
Oh, ow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Some of the working titles for the show was like erosion prevention or something like that. But then
sediment, right? Like,
yeah. But it became clear to like that yeah, erosion prevention. It never quite stuck or settled. It was sort of, you know, it's not about preventing, you know, it's not about preventing the uncontrollable. It's about sort of, you know, living your life and playing your part and experiencing the things that are there to be experienced, I think. But yeah, so it's not about preventing it. It's not about controlling it. It's just about almost accepting, and not in a, you know, disinterested way. Just like, oh, everything's gonna fall apart. You know, I think it's more of like a, yeah, everything's gonna fall apart, but we have to still live. We have to live it, you know?
Well, that's like I think Mike Cloud said that in one of the he's had this really interesting comment in one of the alumni shows a couple years ago. He says, we're every single day we are tasked with the question and the labor. He didn't say it this way, but like of rebuilding our world, right? So to a certain extent, this sort of gets into that question as well. Like, okay, like if it is about these things, what is the emotional toil of the sediment that creates sentiment, which creates memories that we sort of hold and continue on, right? And also this idea of like containment, like what does that imply, right? What kind of labor is built into that? And then what kind of emotional or existential experience does one have when every day you know that you have the task of like rebuilding a thing or maintaining something, right? And I don't know, that seems to be intrinsic to a lot of what we've all experienced in this last year and a half, that we kind of realize how fragile the world is. And like our part in it is not necessarily secure at all. And
Yeah.
we're tasked with this series of choices of like, okay, how are we going to maintain this thing? Or what does containment even mean? Or what does maintenance even mean, right? And all those things do wind up creating a physical embodied series of tasks, but then also like memories, right? And whether it's goals or also like detritus that we sort of like hold as maybe it's personalities or maybe it's identity, so that's kind of what I was thinking about. That might be going too far, right? But I'm saying like the sort of thinking about how fragile everything actually is and like how we manage that.
Yeah. And I do think that, that sort of fragility and management of that fragility, it's something that for me, like everything that I'm sort of looking at and working, the images, the place, they're all changing every second, all the time, they're never going to be that way again. And so for me, I think there's something so kind of lovely and kind of sad about crystallizing that in a painting, in a work that's going to stay that way for a really long time if done correctly, right? So I think there's something a little melancholic but maybe also kind of hopeful about about capturing that in a painted work in this way.
This might be a great time to kind of, on these big, heavy issues that you guys are both grappling with right now, which I hate to end. I know we've got a few questions already coming in. Do you all want to say anything else before we move into asking for questions from our audience? Or should we just get to it?
The only thing I would say is like, if you do have a chance, go see the show, because it does kind of, how you think about it in relation to your body does reorientate your relationship to the work. And yes, there is like a sculptural quality, but then the work does oscillate between the idea of like its physicality, but then also with that pictorial thing. So yeah, I would check it out in that sense. It's a nice way of like sort of seeing the work with much better sense of what Elisabeth's doing with those surfaces.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to you both and to all the people behind the scenes right now. To everybody who's helped put this all together. So thank you.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Yeah. So one of the questions that kind of relates a little bit to what you both were touching on a little bit is, and at this point, I'd like to invite everyone in our audience to either submit questions through the chat, or you can also use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as well. So yeah, one of these questions that is getting to a little bit of what you both were just talking about asks, after or during the painting of these paintings, does your relationship to some of the places that inspire them change?
I love that question. I think it doesn't change because I don't think it's ever really fixed to begin with. So maybe the answer is that it does change, but not necessarily because of the painting. I think through the process of painting and finding different ways to kind of connect and crystallize these spaces, I do think it unlocks new ways of me thinking about these spaces and relating to them. But I do think, it's not like a moment of like, aha, I've figured out what the space is. Now I'm going to paint it and it's just going to stay that way. I think, yeah, maybe it's continually changes and is, yeah. And painting is just kind of one way of trying to figure out what it is.
Another question that we had come in was, it's kind of a long one. As you learn about the materials you use in the painting, such as perlite, both through the tactical use of them and researching their properties, how much does that inform the paintings? Wondering how your experience with the matter that makes up the surfaces changes your own reordering of the experiences represented.
That is a long question, Bree.
It's a good one.
It is a good one. I think that the materials, their sort of behavior very much pushes back against me while I'm working with them. I think it is in a way that I think falls into this the same like squishy realm that I've been referring to, where it's sort of like, okay, what's me here and what's the material? Sometimes it's like hard to negotiate exactly what that line is in trying to get it to do what I want. But I definitely think it's a call and response kind of undertaking.
One thing I could also say to that, just because I know you a little bit in terms of like how you've dealt with things in the lab, but then also how you dealt with things in the studio, is that you are actually like incredibly open to materials and processes. So I don't think you have like a set like anterior destination that you're trying to get to, right? So because of that, I think this idea of it being open to the possibilities and not something that's about learning new skills is really prevalent through everything that you do, right? I think you actually are just, one of the preconditions of most good painting is this idea of curiosity. What are you curious about? And like sort of just being open to figuring out what the potentials are, and without a lot of expectation of where it's supposed to land, no matter what, right? Which is great, because then it takes it out of rhetoric, which then it also allows the work to actually be something that was maybe beyond the scope of where it was in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why the show is so nice, is that it's located because you are located at a person with a subjectivity, but at the same time, all the work is kind of ping-ponging and bouncing around in relationship to these things that you're invested in, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I like about it, because then all that subtext gets a chance to sort of like pop up.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that I don't think I really mentioned, but yeah, it's not like, oh, I plan exactly what it's going to be and then I execute. I think there is a lot of sort of like, what does this stuff do as I'm working?
Yeah.
This looks like a fruit roll up.
I love that description. It gives me something really great to imagine. Another question that just came in was, with work that's so invested in investigating materiality, and so many of these paintings have such a thick textural surface, do you see yourself venturing into more sculptural, three-dimensional forms? Would you consider any of the works in this show to be sculptures of a kind?
Yeah, I think that's, a really important question that definitely comes up. I feel like it's just kind of, maybe the difference between painting and sculpture and drawing and images, like maybe it's not that divisive, I definitely have some, I've worked in sculpture before. I have some works that I'm doing now that are meant to be floor pieces that have more of a, they're painted on the sides and stuff, but they still are paintings. Like there's like the surface, and then that surface stops, and there's the panel under structure. So I think for me, there's a gradient. And I wouldn't say that the sculpture, I wouldn't venture into like actual sculpture, but I will say that, the surface of the painting, thinking about it as this, this plane of reality that we're all kind of on top of. I think there's the kind of conceptual framework of that, and how the work is able to operate with that in mind. These are not the painting with the stones and the grout. It's just on top. I think it means something different if it were actually with stones or grout, or put together in such a way where there's a difference in those things. So I do think that sort of framework of thought is important to the concepts in my work, but that's not to say that sculpture can't do a bunch of like cool, funky stuff like that too in different ways. So I'm open.
Yeah, and I know we talked about this before, but just kind of the idea, in particular, your one work where you're manipulating the paint to become a type of chain link fence, and it's almost sculptural, but it's kind of this murky, almost in between of you're extending what the painting is, but it's not quite a sculpture, because it's not that physical thing of just a chain link fence.
Yeah.
And I also think that, sorry, just real fast.
No.
If you actually were to literalize it with the materials, I don't think it would do the same thing where it sits in a kind of an existential conceptual space. I think it would feel more like earthwork, and it's not to say that it wouldn't be effective, but it would have a really different, we would think about our relationship to these spaces.
Well, I have another question that I'll pose while we're waiting for Andrew to come back, which is kind of hits on exactly what we're talking about just now. But the question is, have you considered adding actual pieces of the environment, collage-like, or is it very important to your work to paint all the elements in your work?
Yeah, I think, I think that with like the tarp landscape pieces and the constructed diversion, the one behind me, and then the other one that incorporate, hi Andrew, welcome back. You were making a good point. I think you probably got most of it out.
Doesn't matter.
But I don't know, like I would say the tarp landscapes and the constructed diversion pieces, those definitely are incorporating more actual pieces of the environment. But the thing is, I'm kind of investigating like what are the bounds of that? The reason why, like we were just talking about, like why the sand and the erosion blanket and the perlite, and why the chain link is paint. I think the perlite and the sand and the erosion blanket have this ability to kind of morph. I don't know. They're a lot of things all at once. And so I feel like those types of relationships are really compelling to me. Whereas chain link is chain link, or a pipe as a pipe, I'm sort of like, I don't know if that's, bringing up the same types of concerns that I'm interested in. And also I'm definitely not interested in incorporating, like, for example, like leaves or things like that, because they're not going to stay. And so any sort of like decaying organic material would be like a hard stop for me, because it's like, this crystallization is important to me at this time. Yeah.
Well, I think that's why maybe those erosion blankets are great, because it can cross signify in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It is a lasting material.
Right.
All right. Well, so I want to invite anybody to add in any last minute questions before we leave. And while we're waiting to see if there are any more questions out there, another question that just came in was, do you ever have a title in mind before you begin a painting?
Hey, Eric. Yeah, well, I would say usually not. Usually this is a little, I have a funny relationship with titles. For example, like the Sediment Sentiment series, the egg tempera paintings, those I did have that in mind because I was sort of had the rest of this body of work for the most part figured out. I was working on the proposal for the show and I was sort of like, okay, this is the missing piece to that puzzle sort of. So for example, those paintings, I did have that title in mind, but usually the point in which I title works, which I do think of titles as important in terms of whether they're signifying like the literal or the metaphorical, or whether they're funny, like, you know, the title that's like 100 words long, a short paragraph. I do think about the titles for sure, but usually I only actually will title something when I'm putting it on a website or on an application or something a little more, you know, where I'm required to do it. A lot of the titles do come from, I write and sketch things. And so it's a lot of times generated out of just my thoughts and writings to myself.
Wonderful. All right, well, I think that will do us for today. Andrew, Elisabeth, thank you so much for allowing us all to be in this intimate conversation with you both. It's been wonderful to hear you both talk about, Elisabeth, your work, and thank you so much.
Yeah, it was super fun.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much for facilitating, Maren.
Yes, thank you very much.
Absolutely. And for anybody else out there, if you want to come visit Elisabeth's show in person, I'm going to echo Andrew, you really should try. If you're outside of the SAIC community, you can contact us, email us, or get in contact with us through our website to schedule a time to come visit the works. We'll also be putting up the videos, kind of like the video we showed at the beginning of the exhibition space for those friends who are unable to come visit, and some more detailed photographs of Elisabeth's work as well. So thank you all so much for coming today.
Thanks very much.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.